Hi, my name's Ray Poynter, and I'm going to be looking at how our research is coping with the pandemic crisis. And this is our Wave 2 report. So perhaps we should start with the elevator pitch. The great news is that it looks like most insight and research professionals around the world are coping. They're either coping well or they're coping. But it's really important to remember that something like 1 in 5 aren't. So we need to find out who they are so that we can help and support them. About half of the people who took part in our study have seen their income drop. And obviously that's really important too. And as part of the study, as I will talk about in a moment, we asked for suggestions. What should the leaders of our profession and industry be doing? And almost half the comments we received related to either looking after our people, so looking after the recruiters, looking after our colleagues, looking after the ecosystem, mental welfare, physical welfare, and finances. So that was one of the two topics that made up half the responses. And the other one was advocate for research. Explain why brands should be doing research. Tell people why it's important for them to be doing research. So that's the whole presentation in a few seconds. So now let's take a more detailed look. First of all, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about why you should trust this data, and I'm going to tell you why you shouldn't trust this data. Then I'm going to highlight the key findings, share some supporting evidence, and then we will tackle so what. So why should you trust this information? Well, we've got plenty of data, which is great. We had 1,000 interviews in the first wave. We had over 1,000 interviews in the second wave. This is because of the fantastic support we have received from so many people. I probably can't remember all of their names now while I'm busy talking, but it's most of the trade associations around the world. SMR, RANS, the Research Society in Australia, which used to be AMSRS until recently, supporters in Japan and Thailand, Insight Association in North America, Merlin, Green Book, just absolutely everybody has come along and lent a hand in making the link and the sample available to as wide a range of people as possible. So that's positive. It's very recent. The first wave was end of March. The second wave, end of April. It's global. We've got data from 79 countries, and we have a mix of open and closed questions. So all of those are really positive. Negatives, it's a convenient sample. Yes, it was widely distributed, but there isn't a proper sampling frame. We don't have a known probability of everybody being a known non-zero probability of all the insight researchers in the world having a chance to do the study. So we need to bear that in mind. The study was conducted in English only, which obviously is a bias in terms of concepts, but also it explains why the sample overrepresents the English-speaking countries. Also, this is a general problem with these sorts of quantitative question studies. It represents what people say. It may not always be how they actually feel. And of course, some of the people who are struggling the most, people who have lost their job with their employer, may not have the same response rate as those who are still working. So there are plenty of reasons why we should also be cautious. So we'll start with the single most important question, in our opinion, in the study. It's the first question. We simply show this picture at the top. How do you personally feel today? And people select one of those 5 faces. We do that because it deals with a lot of the language issues. We don't have to try to work out what do we mean by the opposite of very happy. And anyway, is happy quite the right phrase? And 2 things. First of all is a simple procedural one. You'll notice the data is almost identical between the 2 waves. This is true for all of the questions in the study. For those questions that were asked in wave 1 and wave 2, so in the middle and towards the end of the lockdown periods, there is almost no difference in the data, which is quite staggering if you think about the fact this is 2 convenient samples, the bases are slightly different, all sorts of things could have happened. So that is interesting. We have a relatively static picture at the moment. About half the people picked a happy face, and superficially that looks like a good thing. It would be great to know what it would have been like 6 months ago. Would we have seen that at 70 or 80? But we do need to bear in mind that 1 in 6 people picked a sad face. So that is one of these components that I'm talking about in how many people are not coping. These are the sort of people that we need to be reaching out to, our colleagues, our employees, our suppliers, people who used to work with us who've lost their job, and make sure that we are doing what we can to support them. So people always like to know, how does that vary around the world? So here are all of our geographic reporting units. Now, one of our rules at NewMR is we don't break out samples with smaller than 50 people in the cells. So all of these countries, New Zealand, Spain, Canada, UK, Australia, India, USA, have more than 50 interviews. In fact, they've got more than 86, and it goes up to 352. And that allows us to report those individually. Where we don't have so many interviews per country, we've grouped them by region. So in the green zone, the happiest countries, New Zealand, North and Western Europe, with the exception of Spain and UK, South and Eastern Europe and Spain are all in that green zone. Then we have the average. The middle point is total 48% people picking the smiley face, and Canada and East and South Asia are in the same category. And then we have the red zone, and ignore the ordering. That only runs from 42% to 45%. So there is no statistical difference between those. All of those countries are the countries where fewer people picked the happy face. This is kind of not surprising Sherlock type finding. People who have problems are more inclined to pick the sad face. People who have fewer problems are more inclined to pick the happier face. So happier people tend to be aged over 60. They're based in New Zealand at the moment. They're people who normally work from home. They're people who are working similar hours to how they work. They're in Europe, but they're not in the UK. Their income hasn't changed. And when we say, does working from home suit you? They're likely to say, yes, it suits me. On the flip side, who are the people least likely? They're people who say, well, working from home is not good for me. I've not currently got a job. I'm working fewer hours. My income is reduced. I'm living alone, and I don't normally work from home. Now, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that these are not prescriptive. There are people who are aged over 60, living in New Zealand, who normally work from home, who pick sad, because work is only one part of your whole picture. There are also people who are working fewer hours, income reduced, living alone, who did not pick a sad face. So you can't absolutely, by any means, pick who is having a problem just from these characteristics. It's probably not a bad starting point to check all of those, but you actually need to do some proper employee research. One of the things that I think has been fantastic is that I've seen so many more companies over the past 4 or 5 weeks really ramp up the way they research their own staff and employees to make sure that people are doing okay and finding out what they need. One of the questions in both waves of the studies, we've got a nice big base on this, was where are you currently working? There was almost no change between the 2 waves, and 86% of people said I'm working from home. Now this is a multi-select question, with the exception of people who picked not working. So some of the people are working in the office some of the time and at home some of the time. Some people have picked this other category. So I'm working at home, but I'm also working at a coffee shop. I'm working at home. I'm working in some other location. But the biggest category by far is 86% picking this, I'm working from home. So how is that working out for people? Let's take just those 86% and we say, does it suit you at the moment? And for most people, it suits them. 82% of those people say, yes, it suits me. But about 18%, we're coming back to this 1 in 5, say, no, it doesn't really suit me. And we have a look, and there's a wonderful feature in the software we use to analyze this. We used Harmony from Infotools, and it's got a feature in there called Discover. And it lets you find out the strongest characteristics associated across your whole data set with a particular thing. So we did that, and we said, who is it working less well for? Not surprisingly, people who do not normally work from home are less likely to say working from home works for me. People who picked a sad face, well, we've got a chicken and egg question there, of course. Maybe they picked a sad face because working from home is not working for them. People in India were more likely to say that it wasn't working for them. And interestingly, people aged 21 to 40, the millennials, people who are perhaps perceived to be much more digital, but who may not have the right sort of home setup, or maybe more in need of the physical contact, for whatever reason, more likely to say working from home does not work for them. We also asked in the second wave, what impact has the pandemic had on the number of hours that you work and on your income? So let's take number of hours first. What we see is that about a third of people say they're working more hours now than they were before the pandemic crisis. About a third are working the same, and about a third are working fewer hours. So really, really different in terms of what's happening. So we also asked about the income, and about half have got a similar income to before the pandemic crisis, and about half have got a lower income. There are a few people who've got more complicated answers, and there are 2% of people whose income is higher. And quite often, these are the people you do actually hear of in social media when they're talking about how busy they are and new things are coming through. We get a very interesting, worrying, stark picture when we cross-tab how many hours are people working with their income. So for the people who are working fewer hours, 69% of them said their income was lower. Well, perhaps that's not surprising. For the people working similar hours, however, a third of them are also getting lower income. And it's the same sort of picture, more hours, but 39% getting a lower income. So working more hours, but getting a lower income. So right across the board, we're seeing this lower income coming into play. Who are the people that are most hurt in terms of fewer hours and in terms of lower income? Sole traders are working fewer hours. People who are not working, yet they're not working fewer hours. People in Africa, Middle East and Pakistan, which is one of our geographical reporting units, people whose income is lower tend to be working fewer hours. People in small companies, 2 to 9 employees. So if you work for a company with fewer than 10 people, your odds are much higher that you're working fewer hours. In terms of lower income, sole traders, Australia is a standout region. Much more likely in Australia to be having a reduced income than in any of the reporting units we looked at. If you're not working, you're likely to have a lower income. If you're working fewer hours, you're likely to have a lower income. If you're in Africa, Middle East, and Pakistan, and of course, if you picked a sad face, you're likely to have a lower income. That, of course, is much more likely to be driven by picking a low income, driving the sad face. Now, quick shout out to Norbert and Nikki at MindSpark for suggesting this analysis. They did a great infographic yesterday on the sorts of problems that people are having in companies, particularly small companies, and the things they can do about it. And they did a nice piece of analysis with sections of our data, and I've taken the idea and given it a slightly different spin here. So the company size matters. So this is looking at the people who said they're working fewer hours. Now, reading along the bottom, when we ask people who are freelancers, recruiters, moderators, interviewers, etc., and they work in a one-person company, then fewer hours means that they as an individual are working fewer hours. And this will be true for the other categories, but it doesn't mean the company is working fewer hours. Then when we move up to 2 to 9, we're talking about employees of small companies. And at the far end on the right-hand side, 100 plus, we've got employees of larger companies. And what we see is there is a very, very marked relationship. If you are a one-person company, then 61%, about 2/3, are working fewer hours. That drops and drops. So by the time we get to the largest companies, very few people are saying they're working fewer hours. The same hours, the people in the sole traders are less likely to be saying they're working the same hours. The people in the large companies are more likely to, and there really isn't much difference for the people working in companies 2 to 99. Working more hours, that is a phenomenon particularly of the larger companies. So if we look at that right-hand side, if you work in a large company, most of you are going to be working the same hours or more hours. If you work on your own, you are very likely to be working fewer hours with just a few people working the same or more. Now let's look at income on that, and we see again the people who are sole traders, self-employed, 77%, 3/4 of them reporting a lower income. Up at the large end of the scale, we see the people working in the larger companies, 32%. So that's 1/3 of them reporting less income. Same income, that is a phenomenon of the larger companies. So the 2 to 99 employees, they're all at about 1/2, and that jumps up to 2/3 of people in the large companies. So we have two very different pictures. If you are in a large company, then the probability is you're working the same or more hours and that your income is probably similar. If you are a sole trader, a one-person company, then the probability is your income is down and your hours are down. So if you are in those categories, don't feel that it's something you are doing wrong. This actually is the shape of what's happening around you. And higher income is pretty much only a handful of people anywhere. So one of the questions we ask people to do is type in as an open-ended answer, what suggestions would you give to the leaders of our industry, to the managers, the owners, the people who run the trade associations, etc. And as I mentioned before, there were two groups of answers that were the most common. The first of those is look after our people, look after their physical and mental welfare and finances. Remember that people aren't just trying to work from home. They're homeschooling their kids, they're trying to cope, they're dealing with lockdowns, they've got vulnerable relatives. This is a massive issue that companies need to take on board, that the trade associations take on board. And I think that a lot of the work that we've seen from the trade association has been fantastic. They've nearly all got a COVID support. The vast majority seem to be doing some sort of social catch-ups as well. The second thing, and we are seeing this particularly from some of the trade associations, but maybe not as much from some of the brands as we might do, is advocating the case for MR. Brands need research to navigate their way out of this. Now, we're not saying that you can't avoid cutting some expenditure. Lots and lots of brands are hurting immensely, but they need to recognize that they do need research as part of the solution. So these two categories here represented about half of all the statements. Two of the key ones that I'll highlight: prepare for the future. Now, people, when they talked about prepare for the future, did mention technology, but it wasn't just about technology. It was restructuring the way research is delivered. How are insights going to deliver outcomes that make a difference? So this is thinking that goes beyond the current crisis and says, what do we want to be as an industry? And the second one, which starts now during the crisis, but equally goes beyond it, is go digital and virtual. Yes, people talked about qual, people talked about improving the ability to work remotely, but actually it was much more than that. Again, it was rethinking the processes from start to finish so we can work in new, faster, more productive, more collaborative ways. Now, we've published a report, we published it yesterday. You can get this from the NewMR website, 19 pages full of more data, more tables, and commentary about what we discovered about the industry. So I do encourage you to access that. And just the so what? Well, the first thing is we need to deal with the now, and we need to be dealing with the future. Remember, before we went into the pandemic crisis, many people in our industry were concerned about, were we losing relevance? How were we going to become more focused on delivering insights in a way that improved outcomes for our client? And we still need to be thinking about that, because we've got to deal with the now, but we've got to be heading in the right direction when we come out of the current situation. The good news is that most people are coping. So the most urgent task is helping the people who need it. Yes, 80% of people seem to think that working from home suits them, and we should make sure that that is better enabled in the future, and it's going to be an ongoing part of the way many companies operate. But the urgent task is helping the people who need it. You can't detect who has got problems just from demographics and circumstances. Somebody may look as though they've got the perfect setup, but actually have a really big problem. We're market researchers, we're insight professionals. We know what tools we should be using to check on our people. We need to advocate for research, and collaboration is something that so many people mentioned. Quite a few of the responses we got in the open ends were in Spanish, so I spent quite a lot of time Googling through, and this word collaboration was coming up over and over again from different countries and in different ways. We have seen some of it. We've seen some between brands, we've seen some between associations, but we need to see even more. And yes, we've got to embrace the future, and the future will include digital, but it's not just digital. It is new solutions, and it's new thinking, and it's better ways of turning insights into action. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.